I never thought my life would change because of a dog. At the time, all I cared about was finding a part-time job that could help me pay rent, buy textbooks, and maybe cover a few late-night takeout meals when ramen noodles lost their charm. College had drained me. Classes all morning, shifts at the library in the afternoon, papers piling up, and bills that never seemed to stop. By the time midterms rolled around, I knew I needed extra cash or I'd be in real trouble. That's how I found the ad. It was tacked on the corkboard in the student union between flyers for tutoring sessions and a campus band looking for a drummer. Dog walker needed. Flexible hours. Good pay. There was a phone number and nothing else, no details, not even a name. I tore off the little tab at the bottom and stuffed it in my pocket, figuring that walking dogs sounded easy enough. At least dogs wouldn't ask me to cite MLA sources or quiz me on macroeconomics. The next day I called. A calm, deep voice answered on the second ring. Carter Residence. I stumbled over my words, introducing myself, saying I'd seen the ad. The man paused for a moment, then asked if I could come by that afternoon to meet the pup. His tone wasn't unfriendly, but there was something clipped about it, like he was holding back. The house was only 10 minutes off campus, tucked in a quiet neighborhood I'd never really explored. It stood out immediately. 2 stories of clean white brick with black shutters, a manicured lawn, and a wrought iron fence that looked expensive just to maintain. My sneakers crunched on the gravel path as I made my way to the door, already feeling out of place. The door swung open before I could even knock. A man stood there, tall and composed in a way that made me straighten my posture without thinking. His hair was touched with gray at the temples, neatly combed, and his shirt looked freshly pressed. But there was a weariness in his eyes that the sharpness of his appearance couldn't quite hide. "You must be Alex," I supplied quickly, shifting my backpack higher on my shoulder. "Mr. Carter," he said, offering his hand. His grip was firm, professional, but there was a brief hesitation as if he hadn't shaken hands in a long time. Before I could say anything else, a golden blur shot out from behind him. A large retriever bounded toward me, tail wagging furiously, nearly knocking me off balance as he tried to lick my face. I laughed despite myself, crouching to steady him. "This must be the client," I joked. Carter's mouth curved into something close to a smile. "That's Henry. He's energetic." Henry barked once as if to confirm, then circled around me in excited loops. I patted his head, thinking the job was already won. Dogs loved me, always had. "So," I started, "you want him walked daily? How far usually?" Carter lifted a hand, cutting me off gently. "Not exactly. Henry doesn't really need the exercise. What he needs is company." I blinked at him, not sure I'd heard right. "Company?" "Yes." He gestured for me to step inside. The foyer opened into a wide living space with high ceilings and gleaming hardwood floors. Everything about the house screamed order and polish. Framed art, carefully arranged furniture, not a thing out of place. Yet it felt strangely empty, as if no one truly lived in it. "I'll pay you for the hour," he continued. "But you don't have to walk him unless you want to. Sit with him, keep him occupied. That's all." I glanced at Henry, who was busy dragging one of his toys across the floor. "That's different from what I expected," I admitted. Carter gave a small shrug, as if he'd rehearsed this explanation before. "The truth is, I'm gone often during the day. My husband—" He stopped himself, then cleared his throat. "Well, Henry hates being alone. It makes him anxious. I thought a student might enjoy the work. Easy money." Something about the way he said alone lodged in my chest. His tone was calm, but the word carried a weight that lingered longer than it should have. I smiled anyway, trying to brush off the odd feeling. "I can handle that. Sitting around with a dog is a lot easier than some of the jobs I've had." For the first time, his smile reached his eyes. "Good. You can start tomorrow." We talked through the details, 3 afternoons a week, sometimes more if I was available, cash payment. The rate was better than anything I could have hoped for. I left the house that day with Henry's slobber on my jeans and Carter's voice in my ear, steady but tinged with something unspoken. As I walked back toward campus, I couldn't shake the image of him standing there in the doorway. Sharp suit, gray at the temples, eyes that looked like they carried more nights of silence than any one person should bear. He told me I didn't have to walk the dog, just keep him company. And even then, on that very first day, I wondered who was the job really for. When I showed up the next afternoon, Henry nearly bowled me over again, leash in his mouth, ready to charge through the door. I laughed, reaching down to clip it onto his collar, but Carter stopped me. "You don't have to rush," he said, standing in the hallway with his hands tucked into his pockets. "We can take him out together, just around the block." I blinked. "Oh sure, if that's easier." I wasn't sure why the man who hired me to walk his dog wanted to come along, but I wasn't about to argue. So we walked, Henry bounding happily from tree to tree, sniffing everything in sight, while Carter and I strolled at a slow, measured pace. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of place where houses matched in size and trimmed hedges lined the sidewalks. Carter walked with his shoulders straight, but his voice was softer than I expected when he asked about school. "What are you studying?" "English," I said, tugging lightly on Henry's leash as he tried to chase a squirrel. "Planning to go into teaching, maybe writing if I'm lucky." "Writing," Carter repeated, almost thoughtfully. "Do you write now?" "Mostly essays for professors. A few stories I never finish. Nothing worth showing anyone." He glanced at me, and for a moment I felt pinned under his gaze. Not harsh, not unkind, just intent, like he was looking past the surface. "Even unfinished stories matter," he said. "They tell you where your mind wanders when no one's grading you." It was such a strange, insightful thing to say that I didn't know how to respond. We walked in silence for a bit after that, Henry tugging us both along. That became our routine. I'd come over, clip on Henry's leash, and Carter would join us. Not always, but more often than not. Sometimes we circled the block. Sometimes we didn't even leave the yard. On breezy afternoons, we'd end up sitting on the porch instead. Henry sprawled at our feet, panting happily. Our conversations deepened in small increments. He asked about my family, my classes, the books I read for fun. He listened in a way most people didn't, without interrupting, without rushing to fill silence. And when he talked, it was in careful doses. Stories about his youth, the things he once wanted before life got in the way. He mentioned his husband only in passing, and always vaguely. "He travels a lot for work," Carter would say, or, "He's gone until next week." Each mention was like a pebble dropped into a still pond. Small, quick, but leaving ripples I couldn't ignore. I never asked for details. It felt like crossing a boundary neither of us had agreed on. Still, the more we sat together, the more I noticed the subtle shifts. The way his eyes softened when I laughed at one of Henry's antics. The way he sometimes brushed his fingers against the dog's fur, then paused like he had more to say but swallowed it back. The way his attention lingered just a beat too long. At first, I told myself I was imagining it. After all, what reason would a man like Carter have to look at me that way? He was older, established, living in a house I couldn't dream of affording. I was just the college kid he paid to keep his dog company. But some evenings, when the light fell just right across the porch and his voice dipped lower as he asked about my dreams, I felt the warmth rise in my chest. I couldn't shake the sense that this wasn't casual friendliness. Not entirely. One evening, after a walk cut short by drizzle, we sat inside with steaming mugs of coffee he insisted on making. The house smelled faintly of roasted beans and cedar wood polish. "Do you ever feel," Carter said suddenly, "like you're watching your own life from the outside? Like you're going through motions you didn't choose?" I hesitated, unsure if he expected an answer. "Sometimes," I admitted. "I think everyone does." He nodded, staring into his cup. "It's a strange thing. You wake up one day and realize you're not living the story you thought you would." The words lodged in me, heavy. I wanted to ask him what story he thought he'd be living instead, but I bit my tongue. It wasn't my place. Instead, I reached down to scratch Henry's ears. The dog leaned into me, tail thumping against the floor, blissfully unaware of the tension humming in the room. That's how most afternoons ended, with me walking back to campus, my mind buzzing. I'd replay little moments. The way Carter's voice softened when he said goodnight. The way his hand brushed mine when we both reached for Henry's leash. The way he seemed almost reluctant to let me go. And every time I told myself not to read into it. He was married. He was my employer. He was lonely, sure, but that didn't mean anything more. Still, late at night in my dorm room, I caught myself thinking about him. The gray at his temples, the sadness in his eyes, the warmth that flickered when he smiled at me like I was the only person who'd seen him that day. I should have known better. But something about those walks that weren't really walks, made it harder and harder to convince myself it was all in my head. At first, I told myself the coffee was just polite. After all, plenty of people offered their guests a drink, especially when it was raining or the afternoons stretched lazy. But with Carter, the invitations became part of our routine. Walk the dog, sit for a while, drink coffee that he made with care, as though he'd been waiting for me to arrive just so he could brew it fresh. "You take it with cream, right?" he asked one day, pouring carefully into a mug that looked hand-painted. "2 sugars." I blinked. "You remembered?" He gave a small, almost sheepish smile. "I like details. They matter." It shouldn't have meant anything, but it did. Most people barely remembered my name in classes packed with students, yet here was a man who noticed how I stirred my coffee. It made the warmth in my chest harder to ignore. We began talking more, the conversations no longer confined to surface pleasantries. Henry sprawled happily at our feet, occasionally lifting his head as if to remind us he was still there, though even he seemed content with the new rhythm. Carter shared pieces of himself slowly, as though testing the water each time. "When I was younger, I wanted to be an architect," he said once, tracing the rim of his cup with his finger. "I loved drawing houses, imagining what kind of lives might fit inside them. But then, well, I ended up in finance instead. It paid the bills, but it never fed me the same way." I told him about struggling with rent, about the endless pressure of assignments, about how it felt to know my parents had already sacrificed so much just to see me in school. He listened without judgment, his gaze steady, nodding at the right moments. Sometimes, when I cracked a joke about my pitiful attempts at cooking or my perpetually broken laptop, his laughter rang out sharp and sudden, catching me off guard with how genuine it sounded. It wasn't just conversation, though. It was the small gestures that began to linger with me long after I left. He'd pour my coffee just right, sliding the mug across the table with a faint smile like it was a personal ritual. When a stray piece of lint clung to my shoulder, he brushed it away lightly, fingers barely grazing my shirt, but leaving a spark that made my skin hum. Once, when I shifted to leave too quickly, he steadied my elbow with a touch so gentle it felt more intimate than it should have. Those touches haunted me later, alone in my dorm room. They weren't overt, not the kind you could easily call out, but they lived in the space between what was said and unsaid. And every time I had to remind myself, this man is married. The guilt gnawed at me. I wasn't doing anything wrong. We were just talking, sharing coffee, laughing at Henry when he snored too loudly. But the air between us carried a weight I couldn't deny. I caught myself looking forward to afternoons at his house, not for the paycheck, not even for Henry, but for the quiet way Carter's eyes softened when they landed on me. One evening, after we'd circled the block with Henry, Carter suggested we sit on the porch. He carried out 2 mugs, steam curling into the cool air. The sun dipped low, throwing streaks of gold across the street. "Do you ever feel," he asked quietly, "like you don't belong to your own age? Like you're older or younger than everyone else around you?" I thought about it, sipping slowly. All the time. My friends want parties and hookups, and I'm just tired. I want things that feel real. His eyes flicked to mine, and something unspoken passed between us. Too quick to name but impossible to ignore. He nodded once, then leaned back, gaze drifting to the horizon. We sat there in silence, sipping coffee. Henry sprawled across both our feet like he refused to let us go anywhere. And though nothing happened, though no lines were crossed, the silence felt charged, like the air before a storm. Walking back to campus later, I tried to shake it off. He's just being kind. He's lonely, that's all. Don't turn it into something it's not. But no matter how hard I tried, the echo of his voice, the way he said details matter, clung to me. I told myself the guilt was proof I still knew better. Proof I wasn't about to tumble headfirst into something I couldn't undo. And yet, even as I set my bag down and reached for my textbooks, my mind was still back on that porch, replaying the way his hand had brushed my shoulder like it belonged there. I wasn't sure if I wanted the feeling to go away, or if I was terrified of what it meant that I didn't. The rain that evening came down in steady sheets, turning the street outside into a blur of gray. By the time I reached Carter's front porch, my jacket was soaked through, Henry's excited barking nearly drowned out by the thunder rolling in the distance. Carter opened the door before I knocked, as though he'd been waiting. He looked softer somehow, no pressed shirt this time, just a sweater that hung a little loose on his frame. His hair was slightly mussed, as though he'd been running his hand through it all day. "Come in before you catch pneumonia," he said, ushering me inside. I peeled off my wet jacket, leaving it by the door. The house felt warmer than usual, maybe because of the storm pressing against the windows. Henry bounded over, tail wagging, then settled at Carter's feet as though sensing his mood. "Coffee?" Carter asked automatically, though his tone lacked its usual lightness. "Sure," I said, following him into the kitchen. The familiar ritual should have been comforting, but something in the air was different. He moved slower, his shoulders hunched. We ended up in the living room, mugs in hand, the storm hammering steadily outside. Carter sat across from me, staring into his cup. I waited, sensing he had something on his mind. Finally, he sighed, setting the mug down on the table. "I should probably explain why I hired you." I frowned lightly. "Because Henry needs company?" A humorless smile tugged at his lips. "That's only half the truth." I stayed quiet, letting him continue. "My husband," he began, the word tasting bitter on his tongue, "is gone most of the time. Business trips, late nights, excuses. And when he's here, it's like he isn't. We don't talk. We don't share meals. We move around each other like strangers living in the same house." He paused, fingers tightening around his knee. "Sometimes I think he prefers it that way." The weight of his voice settled in the room, heavier than the storm outside. "I've heard the rumors," he added quietly. "Friends whispering about the men they've seen him with." I never asked. I suppose I was too afraid of the answer. I swallowed hard, unsure what to say. His eyes were glassy but steady, fixed on some point far beyond me. "I didn't put up that ad for Henry," he admitted finally. "Not really. I put it up for myself. To fill the silence. To have someone, anyone, here." His words hit me harder than I expected. I looked at him, this man who seemed so composed, so put together, and saw the cracks spreading beneath. The loneliness he carried wasn't a vague shadow anymore. It was raw, spilling out of him, unguarded. Something twisted in my chest, part pity, part something else I wasn't ready to name. "I'm sorry," I murmured. He gave a small, weary shake of his head. "Don't be. It's not your burden. His voice caught. He looked away, then back again, eyes sharp with something like desperation. I needed to say it out loud to someone who wouldn't use it against me. I set my mug down, leaning forward. "You're not alone in this house, Carter. Not when I'm here." The words slipped out before I could stop them, more intimate than I intended. His gaze snapped to mine, and for a moment, the air between us felt charged. "Alex," he said softly, my name on his lips carrying a weight that made my pulse quicken. Henry shifted, laying his head on Carter's lap, breaking the intensity for a second. Carter's hand absently stroked the dog's fur, but his eyes never left mine. "Do you ever feel," he asked quietly, "like the world decided what your life would be without asking you, and you just followed it, until suddenly you woke up and realized it isn't yours at all?" I nodded slowly. All the time, a silence stretched between us, not empty but thick with everything unsaid. I wanted to reach out, to touch his hand, to ease the ache I saw carved into his expression. But I stayed rooted to my seat, torn between the urge to comfort and the guilt already rising in me. Because underneath the pity, underneath the empathy, there was something else. Something dangerous. The pull I'd been trying to ignore since the first time his eyes lingered on me. And now, sitting here in the dim light, storm raging outside, it felt impossible to pretend I didn't feel it. I forced a laugh, too sharp, trying to break the tension. You know, when I answered that ad, I thought I'd be chasing Henry through the park every day. Not. I trailed off, unsure how to finish. Not listening to a middle-aged man spill his regrets? Carter offered dryly. Not this, I said softer. Whatever this is. His smile was faint, almost sad, but there was warmth there too. I'm glad you did answer it, though. The words hung in the room, more vulnerable than anything else he'd said. And in that moment, I knew. I wasn't imagining it. The closeness, the attention, the way he looked at me. It wasn't just in my head. And that realization was both exhilarating and terrifying. When I left that night, the rain had slowed to a drizzle. Carter walked me to the door, Henry at his side. I hesitated on the threshold, wanting to say something, anything, to acknowledge what had shifted between us. But the words failed me. Instead, he reached out, brushing a stray raindrop from my sleeve, his fingers lingering just a second too long. My breath caught, and his eyes flickered with the same hesitation I felt. Then he pulled back, clearing his throat. See you tomorrow, Alex. Yeah, I said quietly. Tomorrow. As I walked back through the wet streets, my heart pounded. I told myself it was pity, that I only wanted to comfort him. But deep down, I knew better. The ache wasn't just sympathy. It was attraction, raw and undeniable, growing stronger each time I stepped through his door. And no amount of guilt could make it vanish. Dinner wasn't planned. It started with Carter asking if I wanted to stay for takeout, since the rain made going out with Henry impossible. But when I arrived that evening, the table was already set. Candles lit, plates waiting, the smell of something simmering in the kitchen. I cooked, he said when I raised my eyebrows. His voice was casual, but there was a flicker of nervousness in his eyes. It's been a while since I had someone to share a meal with. It should have been nothing, just dinner. But as we sat across from each other, the atmosphere shifted. The candles flickered, casting warm light across his face, softening the hard edges I'd grown used to. Henry curled up in the corner, tail wagging lazily, as if even he understood the night was different. The wine was his idea. A full bottle opened, poured generously. I tried to pace myself, but Carter's glass never stayed full for long. He laughed more easily that night, his voice looser, his stories spilling out. I learned about the time he almost dropped out of college to backpack through Europe, about the novel he once started and never finished, about the first time he saw the ocean and thought it might swallow him whole. And I laughed too at his dry humor, at the way he mimicked professors who used to drone on about numbers and markets. The laughter warmed me, loosened the guilt I always carried in the back of my throat when I was with him. But as the meal stretched into lingering silence, the air between us thickened. Carter leaned back, his shirt collar undone, his face flushed from wine. He swirled what was left in his glass and then set it down with a quiet sigh. I forgot what this feels like, he murmured. What does? I asked, my voice barely above the hum of the rain outside. Having company. Real company. His eyes lifted to mine, and suddenly it wasn't casual anymore. His gaze was steady, unguarded, as though he'd stripped off layers I hadn't realized were there. The silence between us stretched, electric. I felt it, the pull I'd been trying to deny for weeks. His hand rested on the table, and when I shifted slightly, my fingers brushed his. A spark shot through me, sharp and immediate, leaving me frozen. He didn't move his hand away. Instead, his thumb grazed the back of mine, feather-light but deliberate. My breath caught. Alex, he said softly, and the way he said my name, it wasn't a question, it wasn't a statement, it was something in between. I looked at him, really looked. His eyes weren't cold, weren't guarded. They were vulnerable, wide open, carrying loneliness and longing that made my chest ache. His face leaned closer, just a fraction, but enough to set my pulse racing. The world seemed to narrow. The quiet patter of rain, the flicker of candlelight, the warmth of his hand brushing mine. His lips were inches from mine. I could smell the faint trace of wine, feel the heat of him so close I swore the air was bending. And for a heartbeat, I wanted nothing more than to close that gap. But panic surged just as quickly. I pulled back, chair scraping against the floor. My chest heaved, and I shook my head, words tumbling out before I could stop them. I can't. You're married. The words cut through the air, sharp and desperate. Carter froze, his eyes flickering with something I couldn't name. Pain? Shame? Maybe both. His hand dropped back to the table, curling into a fist. I know, he said quietly. His voice wasn't defensive, wasn't angry, just hollow. The silence that followed was deafening. I stared at the table, the half-empty wine bottle, Henry shifting in his sleep. Anything but him. My heartbeat pounded in my ears, torn between the desire that still burned in me and the morality that anchored me in place. When I finally looked up, Carter was watching me. Not with blame, not even with disappointment. Just a deep, unspoken ache. I'm sorry, I whispered, though I wasn't even sure what I was apologizing for. Pulling away, almost letting it happen, or wanting it so badly in the first place. You don't have to be, he said softly. He leaned back in his chair, putting space between us. His eyes shifted to the window, where raindrops streaked the glass. I crossed a line. That's on me. I stood, suddenly restless. I should go. He didn't argue, didn't ask me to stay. He just nodded once, his jaw tightening, and rose to walk me to the door. As I pulled on my jacket, he reached for the doorknob, then paused. For a second, I thought he might say something. Something that would undo me, something that would pull me back inside. But he didn't. He just opened the door, letting the cool night air spill in. Good night, Alex, he said, voice low, almost fragile. Good night, I echoed, though the word felt too small for what had just passed between us. I stepped into the rain, heart hammering, my body buzzing as though the almost kiss still hovered in the space between us. Each step back toward campus felt heavier, torn between two truths, that I had done the right thing, and that part of me wished I hadn't. By the time I reached my dorm, my clothes clinging damp to my skin, the guilt had settled in, but so had something else. Desire, longing, confusion that twisted into my stomach until I could hardly breathe. I lay awake for hours that night, replaying it all. The warmth of his hand, the look in his eyes, the inches between us that could have changed everything. And every time, I whispered the same reminder into the darkness. He's married. He's married. He's married. But the echo that answered, quiet and insistent, was this. And yet you wanted him anyway. The days that followed were heavy with silence. I still came by, but the rhythm had changed. No dinners, no lingering coffee. Carter was polite, even warm in small ways, but careful. Too careful. We walked Henry together once or twice, but mostly I found myself pacing the block alone, Carter's absence pressing on me even when he wasn't there. At night, I told myself it was for the best. That pulling back had been the right choice. That maybe I should quit before things got messy. I drafted the words in my head. Thank you for the opportunity, but I need to focus on school. Each time, though, I couldn't bring myself to say them. The truth was I missed him. Not just the laughter or the small touches, but the way his attention made me feel seen. And I hated myself a little for that. 3 days into this fragile distance, my phone rang late in the evening. Carter's name lit up the screen. My heart lurched. For a moment, I considered letting it go to voicemail, but something in me knew I couldn't. Hello. My voice was cautious. Alex. His voice was low, frayed at the edges, unlike I'd ever heard it. Can you come over? I hesitated, pulse quickening. Is everything okay? A pause, then, please. The break in his voice gutted me. Before I could second-guess myself, I was out the door, walking fast through the cool night air. By the time I reached his house, My chest was tight with nerves and something dangerously close to longing. He opened the door before I knocked, like he had that stormy night. But this time he looked different. Unshaven, his sweater rumpled, eyes ringed with exhaustion. Henry trotted up to me with his usual enthusiasm, but even he seemed subdued, curling quickly back into his spot on the rug. Carter stepped aside, and I entered without a word. We sat on the couch, side by side, the silence pressing down like the air before a storm. Minutes passed. I fiddled with a loose thread on my jeans, waiting, unsure if I should break it. Finally, his voice cut through, raw and quiet. "I'm so tired of being invisible." The words hit me like a punch. I turned to him. His hands were clenched in his lap, shoulders hunched forward. His eyes glistened, but he didn't look away. "Invisible to him," he added, his voice cracking. "To the man I married. To the life I built. I walk into rooms and I might as well not exist. And when I finally started to believe that, you showed up. You looked at me, Alex. Really looked." My throat tightened. I wanted to say something, anything, but the words tangled inside me. So instead, I reached out, placing my hand gently over his. He flinched just slightly, then stilled. His gaze dropped to our hands, my fingers covering his trembling ones. Slowly, hesitantly, he turned his hand over, threading his fingers with mine. The contact sent heat surging through me, steady and electric. "Carter?" I whispered, but whatever I'd meant to say was lost when he finally lifted his eyes to mine. The look there undid me, raw, vulnerable, begging without asking. He leaned closer, slow enough that I could have pulled away, slow enough that it felt like he was asking permission with every inch. I didn't move. When his lips touched mine, it wasn't fire at first. It was fragile, tentative, like he was afraid the moment would break if he pressed too hard. The kiss was soft, almost trembling, but it shattered something inside me anyway. My hand tightened around his as I leaned in, closing the distance fully. The taste of wine lingered faintly on his lips, mixed with something unmistakably his. The world outside ceased to exist, the silence, the storm, the guilt. There was only the warmth of him, the ache of all the weeks we'd been circling this moment. When we finally broke apart, our foreheads rested together, breaths ragged. His hand slid to my cheek, thumb brushing lightly as though to anchor himself. "I shouldn't," he began, but his voice cracked and he couldn't finish. "I know," I whispered, my chest heaving. But neither of us stopped. We sat there in silence, clinging to each other as though letting go would undo everything. My heart pounded, equal parts terror and relief. Because in that moment, I knew the truth. I wasn't just walking his dog anymore. I wasn't even just keeping him company. I was stepping into something deeper, something dangerous, something I couldn't turn back from. And even as guilt twisted inside me, I knew I didn't want to. The weeks that followed blurred into something I couldn't name, half dream, half confession. I still told people I was walking dogs, but what I was really doing was slipping into another world. A world that belonged only to Carter and me. It started quietly. After that first kiss, neither of us spoke about what it meant. The next time I came over, we didn't rush into each other's arms or pretend it hadn't happened. We simply carried on. Walks around the block with Henry, coffee at the table, laughter breaking through the silences. Only now, there were touches that lingered. His hand brushing mine as he poured coffee, my knee pressed against his under the table, a look that lasted one heartbeat too long. Late nights became hours. I'd stay long after the dog had fallen asleep. The two of us curled on the couch, voices dropping into softer tones meant only for each other. He'd ask about the future I dreamed of, and I'd ask about the past he rarely shared. His stories came in pieces. How he once believed in romance, how he'd promised forever and watched it turn into indifference. His voice carried regret, but when he looked at me, I saw something else, something alive. Sometimes I stayed so late that I left just before sunrise, the air sharp and cold, my skin still tingling from the ghost of his touch. Those mornings felt stolen, like sunlight spilling through a crack in a locked door. I knew it wasn't mine to keep, but I cherished it anyway. And with each passing day, the guilt grew heavier. I was alive in a way I'd never been before. Seen, wanted, needed. But I was also the other man. The thought gnawed at me when I lay awake in my dorm, staring at the ceiling. I knew what people would say if they knew. I knew what it meant to cross that line. Yet, every time I thought about stepping back, I remembered the look in his eyes when he whispered my name, and my resolve dissolved. The danger of it all came crashing close one evening. We were in the kitchen, glasses of wine half empty, when the front door clicked open. Carter froze, his face draining of color. "He's not supposed to be back until Thursday," he whispered. My heart thundered. I glanced around wildly, panic clawing at me. Henry barked once, tail wagging, oblivious to the tension snapping through the air. "Go," Carter hissed, gesturing toward the back. Through the patio, I stumbled out, nearly tripping over the rug as footsteps echoed in the hall. My pulse roared in my ears. I slipped through the sliding door, crouching low behind the hedge as the sound of another man's voice carried faintly from inside. Calm, practiced like he belonged here. For 10 long minutes, I crouched there in the dark, rain soaking into my shoes, fear gnawing at my throat. Then, slowly, the voices faded deeper into the house. Carter appeared at the door, his face etched with tension, and mouthed, "Go." I left that night with my hands shaking, the weight of what we were doing pressing down like a storm cloud. The next day, I didn't go back, nor the day after. I told myself it was a sign, a chance to end things before it went too far. But on the third night, my phone rang again. "Alex." His voice was rough, almost breaking. "I'm sorry about the other night. I should have been more careful. But please, don't disappear on me." I hesitated, torn between sense and desire. "This is dangerous, Carter. We could have been caught." "I know," he admitted. Then, after a long silence, "But I don't love him anymore. I think I've been waiting for you." The words hit harder than I expected. My throat tightened, my heart lurching. Part of me wanted to believe him fully, to let the confession wash away the guilt. Another part whispered that it was selfish, that I was stepping into a place I didn't belong. Still, I went back. I couldn't stay away. When I walked into his house again, his relief was visible, etched in the way his shoulders dropped, in the way his hand found mine like it was natural, inevitable. That night, we kissed again. Not tentative this time, but certain, desperate. The walls we'd built crumbled, and for the first time, I let myself stop fighting. In his arms, I felt something I hadn't known I was missing. Not just desire, but belonging. Terrified me, how much I wanted it. Every step we took deeper into the shadows of this affair, the more I knew I was walking a path with no way back. And yet, when his lips brushed my temple and his voice whispered, "You make me feel alive again," I decided, for that moment, that hour, that breath, it was enough. There comes a point where you can't hide from yourself anymore. For weeks, I'd been floating between two lives. The student with overdue papers and ramen dinners, and the man who slipped into Carter's world, where candlelight softened every edge and whispers made the silence bearable. But guilt has sharp teeth. It gnawed at me late at night when I stared at the ceiling, asking questions I couldn't answer. Was I helping Carter escape a prison? Or was I just the distraction he needed to keep avoiding the truth? Was I building something real with him? Or was I breaking something sacred? I almost quit again. I rehearsed it, imagined myself knocking on his door one last time, handing back the house key he'd slipped me, saying, "This has to end." But when I finally saw him again, my resolve cracked. He looked exhausted, his face thinner, his eyes shadowed. But when he saw me, they lit with something raw and real. We sat in the living room, Henry sprawled across both our legs like a bridge between us. The quiet was thick, like both of us were holding back words that had been clawing to get out. Finally, Carter broke it. "I filed the papers," he said, his voice steady but low. I blinked. "Papers?" He met my gaze directly. "Divorce. I started the process last week." My breath caught, the weight of it sinking in. "Because of me?" He shook his head, firm. Because of me. Because I can't live like this anymore. I can't pretend to be in a marriage that's nothing but silence and shadows. That would have been true whether you walked into this house or not. I wanted to believe him. God, I wanted to. But fear prickled through me. But I'm part of this. I don't want to just be. I stopped, struggling for the word. A mistake. You're not, he said quickly, almost urgently. Alex, you're not. If anything, you made me remember I still have a pulse. That I'm allowed to want more than emptiness. Silence filled the space again. Heavy but different now. His hand reached across Henry's back, finding mine, squeezing lightly. I stared at our joined hands, torn between two truths. Walking away would be the clean choice, the responsible choice. But staying felt like life itself. You scare me, I admitted quietly. His thumb brushed over my knuckles. I scare myself too. We didn't kiss then. We didn't need to. The weight of his words was enough to shift something inside me. For the first time, it didn't feel like I was stealing moments that didn't belong to me. Felt like we were choosing them. Still, I knew it wouldn't be simple. People would talk. His husband would fight, maybe lash out. I'd still be the younger one, the outsider, the name whispered in judgment. But when Carter looked at me with eyes that seemed less hollow than the day we met, I thought maybe it was worth it. The days that followed weren't easy. Some mornings he was distant, trapped in legal calls and paperwork. Other nights, he'd sit beside me on the porch, silent, like he was mourning a ghost of something that had already died long ago. But through it all, he kept reaching for me. Small touches, late-night confessions, the warmth of his hand steadying me in ways I didn't know I needed. And me? I kept showing up. Not because of the paycheck, not even because of Henry, though the dog never stopped making me laugh. I showed up because walking away felt like cutting out a part of myself I wasn't ready to lose. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the houses, Carter leaned against the doorway while I tugged Henry's leash free. He looked tired, but softer than I'd ever seen him. You know, he said, when I first put up that ad, I thought I was looking for someone to walk my dog. He smiled faintly, shaking his head. Turns out I was looking for someone to remind me I was still human. I swallowed hard, my chest tight. And did you find that? His eyes lingered on mine, warm, vulnerable. I think I did. I left that night with my heart pounding, but not from guilt this time. From hope. Tentative, fragile, but real. It wasn't a fairy tale. Divorce papers don't sign themselves. Lives don't untangle neatly just because two people kiss. But something had shifted. We weren't circling the line anymore. We'd crossed it together. And maybe, just maybe, we'd keep walking forward. When I think back to that first day, standing awkwardly in his perfect foyer with Henry bounding at my feet, I can't help but smile at how wrong I was. I thought it was just a job, a way to pay the bills, a handful of hours to pass the time. But as I sit now with Henry's head in my lap, Carter's hand brushing mine on the porch swing, I know better. I was hired to walk his dog. But in the end, what I walked into was his heart. And somehow, he walked into mine.